Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, you articulated in your opening statement that perhaps the top concern in our country right now is the prevalence of violence and violent crime in our communities, and I think we all agree with that. One of the other serious concerns we have is the decreasing amount of faith that many Americans have in our institutions. And among the most important of our institutions in America, of course, is our system of justice. And over the past few years, millions of Americans have begun to question whether we can still rely upon the maxim of equal justice under law and whether justice is blind and all the rest. One of the reasons for this is the very real perception that some individuals within the DOJ and FBI have abused their authority and engaged in selective enforcement of certain statutes. One example that comes to mind is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So I wanted to ask you if you're aware that during Special Counsel Mueller's probe, there were at least 5 indictments of conservatives under FARA, and if you know how that compares to the prevalence of previous FARA prosecutions since the enactment of that statute more than 80 years ago.
I'm probably not the right person to provide a whole lot of information about Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I'd rather, that's probably better referred to what's left of that office, I suppose. But certainly FARA that you're referring to is an extremely important tool that we in the FBI have been pushing for a while to be using more aggressively, in particular against the Chinese threat, because so much of it is reflected through people engaged in activity that we think could appropriately be pursued under FARA. So exactly how it compares, I'm not sure I have that information.
Well, here's the point. We agree with that, and I think we need to be aggressive against the CCP for sure. We're all on the same page there. But according to reports, there were as many FARA prosecutions during the previous 40 years as there were during the 18 months of the Mueller probe. George Papadopoulos, for example, stated that he was given the choice to either, quote, accept the charge that I lied or face FARA charges, and that while FARA has been widely ignored for years, the Special Counsel's Office has dusted the statute off as a prime weapon to get members of the Trump circle to talk, right, unquote. The FBI and the Justice Department used FARA throughout their investigation into Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, but nothing ever came from those charges. The Justice Department stated in its motion to dismiss the case that the FBI's closing communication, quote, made clear that the FBI had found no basis to predicate further investigative efforts into whether Mr. Flynn was being directed and controlled by a foreign power, Russia in that case, in a manner that threatened U.S. national security or violated FARA or its related statutes, unquote. So the question is, it seems to a lot of Americans that alleged FARA violations were used as either a pretext to investigate those with ties to President Trump, or that FARA charges were used to pressure those conservatives in a bid to find a connection between the Trump campaign and Russia. So regardless of the details of the Mueller probe, I get that you're not the expert on that. The question is, how could anyone see this otherwise? Doesn't it look like that was selective enforcement?
I certainly understand the purpose of the question, the point of the question. I'm not sure that I can really speak to what people would perceive. What I can say is that, again, separate from the Special Counsel's investigation, which is really, respectfully, probably not my place to comment on, I do think that more aggressive use of the Foreign Agents Registration Act is something that former Attorney General Barr and I, for example, discussed quite a bit, and trying to use it more aggressively than it had been used in the past, partly for the reason we've already talked about.
On June 3rd of this year, Politico reported that the Justice Department is now investigating a Democrat lobbying firm for failing to comply with FARA and its representation of B0MBSHELL Holdings while Hunter Biden served on its board. And up until about a week ago, when this news was first reported, there was a very real perception that enhanced enforcement was being used only against Republicans and conservatives. So the question is, can you confirm the FBI's commitment to fervently pursue these violations, as you said, more aggressively, but to do it regardless of the political party affiliations of the subject of the investigation?
I think political party affiliations should have zero place in our decision to enforce the Foreign Agents Registration Act or any other statute. And you can be sure that as long as I have anything to say about it, we're going to enforce it in an even-handed way without respect to anybody's political affiliation.
I got 19 seconds left. I'll just say that even hand in this perception that we're talking about is increasingly important in our republic, because if people if they don't have faith in the system of justice, if they think that Lady Justice is the symbol, has the blindfold up and she's peering beneath it, then we lose an important element that holds the Republic together. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you for your time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Bass.
First of all, thank you very much for your service, Director Wray. And I also want to thank you for finally abandoning the category of Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement. My understanding now is that there is a new category, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. And I'm actually concerned about this as well. And I'm concerned about it because of the FBI's long history of collapsing Black activism in the fight for civil rights, and especially against police abuse, with terrorism. So even in this document, several Black individuals and one organization is included along with well-known white supremacist domestic organizations, domestic terrorist organizations. The FBI says from 2015 through 2019, approximately 846 individuals were arrested for domestic terrorism. And I wanted to know how many of these were African American?
Congresswoman, I appreciate your comments about the changes we made in response to some of the conversations we had early in my tenure on the so-called BIE issue. The particular document you're reading from, I'm not sure sitting here right now that I'm certain which document you're referring to, so maybe the best thing to do there would be for us to have my staff follow up with yours and be sure that I'm answering. Yeah.
Let me ask you several other questions. Do you know of any Black domestic terrorist organizations? Could you tell me their names and what attacks that they have landed? I wanted to know if you consider, or if the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter is considered a racially motivated violent extremist organization.
I appreciate the question because this is something that I think is important for me to be able to clarify really across the spectrum. So the first point that's really important here is that we don't designate domestic terrorist organizations, period. Unlike on the foreign terrorist enforcement side, where there's a specific statutory scheme for designating terrorist organizations, there is no such scheme for domestic terrorism, whether it's on the in the end that you're talking about or any other end. Having said this, but can I? Sorry.
Organizations as domestic
So,
terrorists?
Sorry.
White, Black, or otherwise?
I couldn't hear the. You flickered out there.
You don't, you just said you don't consider, you don't designate organizations as domestic terrorist organizations?
That's correct. What we do is investigate individuals with proper predication. In some instances, those individuals will conspire or engage in criminal conduct with each other. And in some cases, we will open a conspiracy investigation or a so-called enterprise investigation.
Do you have investigations of Black individuals or activists that are involved in the movement around police abuse or civil rights in those categories? And the reason why I'm asking that is because there's a number of Black Lives Matter individuals, leaders who have been visited regularly by the FBI in their homes, who have been asked about their plans for various protests, et cetera. Some of those individuals might not be aware that if they misrepresent certain facts to the FBI, that they could in fact be committing a crime. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about your surveillance of these organizations. And it's my understanding that there were a couple of protests where the FBI did surveillance and used surveillance aircraft, actually, with organizations that were protesting in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
So we're talking about a few different things here. So the first thing is we do investigate individuals for criminal activity that occur and violence that occurs in the middle of protests, regardless of what the basis of their protest is. And I really can't speak to specific cases because I would need to know the facts, and I would also need to make sure that I wasn't talking about an ongoing investigation. We do not investigate First Amendment groups. We don't investigate people for speech, for association, for assembly, for membership in domestic First Amendment groups. We have had a few cases that I can think of off the top of my head in the last 2 years involving individuals who committed domestic what we would consider domestic terror attacks, justifying their attacks, lethal attacks, I should add, justifying their attacks based on their interpretation of the so-called Black Hebrew Israelite faith. That's probably the best example that I could give you, but that's about the only thing that comes to mind as we're sitting here talking right now.